All right, so since we don't have many questions and I'm still during office hours, I think what I'm going to do now is start going over the solutions to the ArrayList homework. So if you haven't attempted the ArrayList homework problems yet, I would suggest you don't watch this part of the video. Go ahead and start attempting those problems, and that way you can come back to this video and then see how you did in terms of scoring and see if you got the solutions correct. So there were 3 questions in the ArrayList homework. They were all previous AP problems. One of them was from 2004, another one was from 2012, and the last was from 2017. All of them are actually problem number 1, but that doesn't mean that they were necessarily the easiest. In fact, in some of them, it was actually the hardest problem. So we're going to look at the first problem. The first problem was from 2004, and it was called, the class that we worked with was called WordList. So it says the following class WordList is designed to store and manipulate a list of words. The incomplete class declarations given below, and you'll be asked to implement 2 methods. So here's our class, and all we know is that there is one array list called myList, which is stored inside of a WordList object. They're going to ask us to implement 2 methods. The first one is num words of length, and the second one is remove words of length. So they give an example of how num words of length works. Here's our, let's say inside of our WordList object, we have this array list. And the array list contains the words cat, mouse, frog, dog, and dog. So you can repeat the same word. And it says the table shows several simple calls to num words of length. So animals.num words of length 4. So what it's doing here is it's going to count the number of words that are length 4. So cat is 3, so that doesn't satisfy it. Mouse is 5, so that doesn't satisfy it. Frog is 4, dog is 3, and dog is 3. So there's only one word, or one string that was length 4, so it returns 1. Whereas num words of length 3, cat, dog, and dog, that returns 3. 2, there's no strings of length 2 here, so that returns 0. So what we have to do is we're going to traverse the array list. We're going to go through every single array, and every single string, and we're going to count the number of letters in that string. But we know we have a method for that. Length method counts it for us. And then we're going to compare it to the given parameter. Okay, so if we look really quickly at the score for this one, this was question number 1. The average score on this was 5.83. It's about the easiest problem that you'll find on an AP exam, 5.83 out of 9. I don't know that there are any ones that have ever had a higher score than that. All right. As a reminder, 2004 was the first year that they gave the exam in Java. So in general, you can see the questions had pretty high scores, 5.83, 5.20, 4.03 is about an average, 4.37 about average. So they had 2 kind of average difficulty problems and 2 easy problems. So they had no hard problems in 2004. This is the first year they were giving the exam. All right, so let's look at how we solve this one in part A. So I mentioned already we're going to be traversing the array. Oh, you know what? I didn't pull up the solutions for this yet. Well, let's just do it in our notepad. Okay. So we know that we need to traverse our array list, which is called myList. We're going to go one string at a time, and we're going to compare the length of the string to the given parameter. So first we need to declare the method. All right, the method is actually already declared for you down here. So I'm just going to copy that. Public int num words of length, and the parameter here is an int called len. So I'm going to traverse the array list. So I'm going to say for, an easy way to traverse an array list using a for each loop. So I'm going to use a for each loop here. So I'm going to say for each, and remember there are strings inside of my list. I'm going to call it word in my list. So for each word in my list, we're going to compare the length of the word. So if word length, remember this is a method inside the string class, is equal to len, then what? We have to think about what do we want to do? Well, what I want to do is I want to count the number of words that have this length. So before my loop, what I have to do is I have to declare a counting variable. So I'm going to say count equals 0. So now if the word.length is equal to len, then I'm going to increment count. Close my if statement. right? If the length of the word is not equal to len, then I do nothing. I don't increment count, so I just leave it. So I don't have to put an else there, right? And then once I complete the entire for loop, that means I went through every single string and compared to the parameter len. And at the end, count should contain the right amount, so I'm going to return count. So that's part A. Okay, so in this case, I don't have the solution, so I'm not sure how many points are in part A. All right, but let's look at part B. Part B, all right, part B asks us to write the word list method remove words of length. So it says method remove words of length removes all words from the word list that are exactly len letters long. So it's pretty similar to what we did in part A, but now what we do is if we call on, let's say, animals.remove words of length 4, it's going to remove every string that has 4 characters. So in this case, frog has 4 characters, so it's just going to remove frog. Right? Then this shows a sequence. So now if I remove words of length 3, it's going to remove cat, dog, and dog. So the only thing left is going to be mouse. And then remove words of length 2 doesn't do anything, doesn't remove anything, so mouse still stays there. Okay, so this is a mutator method. So you can see down here, void return type. So I'm not returning anything to the user. All right, remove words of length. Again, our parameter is called len. Now, I need to, again, traverse my array list. Okay, but when I'm traversing an array list, okay, what I have to do here is I have to, instead of using a for each loop, since I'm manipulating the array list in some way, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a regular for loop. So I'm going to say for int I equal to 0. You know what, we're actually going to start at the end. So I'm going to say for int I equal to, in this case, it's called mylist.size. I greater than or equal to 0, I minus minus. Right? And the reason that we're doing this is if we start at the beginning of the array list, you remember when we use a for loop, if I'm removing elements, there's a chance that I'm going to skip one. But if I start at the end and I remove an element and then decrement, there's no chance of skipping an element. So in this case, I'm not going to skip an element if I start at the end and decrement. So that's what I'm going to do. And now I'm going to, again, write my if statement here. And I'm going to say if. Now, in this case, I can't use the word local variable that I declared in the previous method. Instead, I have to use the get method from the ArrayList class. So I'm going to say if mylist.get at index I, and then now I want the length of it. Right? So I'm first accessing the string by using the get method, and then I'm finding the length of the string by calling the length method. Right? If that's equal to len, then I want to remove it. So I'm going to say mylist.remove, and then you just give the index that you want to remove. So at the end of my for loop, my list should have removed all the elements that I want to remove, and then I don't return anything to the user, so I'm done there. Okay. So part A and part B for the first question 2004. B is definitely more difficult than A. A was very basic, but I think A was still worth maybe 3 or 4 points. So you can get a lot of points on this problem, even if we don't get all of part B right. And the trick to part B was making sure we don't skip any elements. And we've gone over this algorithm a few times before. So we've seen this where we need to adjust our for loop when we're removing elements from an array list, so we don't skip any elements. So looking at the second problem from this ArrayList review homework, we have this climb info class that's described to us. We actually are implementing 2 methods, but we're implementing them, one of the methods, 2 different ways. So we can see the climb info class has an object, so it says, creates a climb info object with the name peak name and time climb time. So the climb info class is actually the objects that are going to be stored inside of another class. So the class that we're actually going to be working with is called climbing club. And climbing club keeps a list of climb info objects inside of it. So this is where we can see what we call aggregation, where I have a class called climb info, which stores information about a single climb, and then this other class, climbing club, stores an array list of climb info objects. So we're storing objects inside of a list which is stored inside of another object. So this encapsulation, it's like one inside of another inside of a larger object, right? So what we need to do is inside of this climbing club class, we need to implement the add climb method two different ways. One of them, it says add the objects in the order they were added, and the second one says add the objects in alphabetical order by their name, the name of the mountain or the hill that they're climbing. And then part C is called distinct peak names. Part C we're going to see is not really a free response question, so I'm not going to go over it too much. But let's look at part A and B are both pretty good ones here. So let me make this so I can read it. So in part A, it asks us to implement this add climb method in the order in which they're added. So they give you an example here. They call the add climb method 4 times, and Monadnock, Whiteface, Algonquin, and Monadnock again. So it's in that same order in which they're added. So this is a more straightforward application. All we're going to do is just add these objects to our array list. So the add climb method takes in a string and a integer. Right, so we can see here it takes in a string and an integer. But remember, my array list contains climb info objects. So what I have to do is I'm going to have to call in the climb info constructor to construct a climb info object and then add that climb info object. So what I'm going to do is first write down the declaration. Public void add climb, string peak name, and int climb time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my climb info object. So I'll say climb info. We can call it whatever we want. Let's call it add, because it's what we're going to add. Alright, climb info add equals new climb info, and I'm just going to take the peak name and the climb time and use that to create my new climb info object. So here's my new climb info object that I've added. I'm adjusting the font so we can read it. Alright, so now that I've created a new climb info object, all I have to do is add that to my array list. Now the array list is being stored inside of the object, inside of the climbing club object, which is the implicit parameter. So I don't have to put this, but just to illustrate that we're calling it on the implicit parameter. Right, so I'm going to say this dot, and now what I'm adding it to is this climb list instance variable. So climb list dot add. You know what? I shouldn't use add here because add is the name of the method, so that gets confusing. So let's just call it a climb. So I added the climb, right, the new climb to my climb list. And that's all I need to do, right? Just the order in which they're added. That's how I'm going to add them. So this way I don't need to worry about an ordering here. Now for the second one, for part B, it wants me to add them in alphabetical order. So now what I need to do is I need to assume that there are already elements that are inside of the list, and now I need to check to see where they should go in my list. Should it go in the first position, the second position, the third position? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare it just like I did before, part B. Right, public void add climb, string peak name, and int climb time. So same method declaration, right? And I can create the climb info object just like I did in the first one. So climb info a climb equals new climb info peak name and climb time. right? Just like I did in the first problem, but now I can't just add it to the end of the list like I did in the first part, right? I need to figure out where it's supposed to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create an integer I, and I'm going to figure out where it's supposed to go by using a while loop. So I'm going to say while, and since I'm looking at alphabetical ordering, I'm going to use the compare to method from the string class. So I'm going to say while, remember it's peak name, right? Peak name dot compare to, and now I want to look at the name from the list, right? I want to look at the name from the list. You know what, thinking about this, I was thinking a while loop would work here, but then what I recognize is that if I write a while loop based on the compare to method, I don't have an index here to access my array list. So I also need to, I think, no, this works. I can use I. Okay, so I can say compare to, and now I'm going to call on my list, which if you remember, the list was called climb list. Dot. I need to use the method from the climb info class. So I'm going to scroll up here. So there is a method called, oh wait, no, sorry. There's a method called getName. So if all of that is less than 0, I know this is a lot, so let's break this down. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm comparing the name of the peak that I'm adding to the name of the peak that's already in the list. And if it's less than 0, right, that means that this should go before the climb that's already in the list. So I want to go past that. I want to increment past that. So what I'm going to do is, if that's true, or while that's true, I'm going to increment I. And what this is going to do is this loop will break once I find the correct index. Once I find the correct index where that my new climb is supposed to go, the loop breaks. So now I stores the correct index of where it's supposed to go. So that now what I can do is I can say, just like before, this.climbList.add. But now I'm going to give it an index of where I want it to add it to. I want to add it at index I, and I'm going to add a climb. Now when I was scrolling up, okay, never mind. We're good. Okay, so this is part B. So this will add the climb at the correct index. So this while loop is necessary with this integer I in order to figure out which index I should start at. Now I could use my while loop and flip it the other way around, start I at the very end of the list and then decrement it until I find the right position, but it's the same thing. Either way, it's going to end up in the right spot. Okay, now if we scroll down to part C is kind of funky, something that we haven't seen before. They actually give us the implementation for a method called distinct peak names, and then they ask us, does this implementation work, yes or no? Does this implementation work for this other method, yes or no? So they've done this once on the AP exam and they've never done it again, so I don't think they would do this again. So I'm going to skip over this right now, but basically it's almost turning it into a multiple choice problem, and this is only worth 1 point. Right? I think for this one, part A was worth 4, part B was worth 4, and then part C is only worth 1 point. So obviously they just needed an additional point to add in, so they added in this thing that makes it kind of like a multiple choice question. But I wouldn't worry about it right now. You can still attempt this problem, but we don't really need to go over the solution to this one. All right? If we look at the average score on this one, it was actually the hardest problem on the test, question number 1. It was average score 4.12, which is about average. Anything around 4, a little bit over 4, is an average difficulty. Okay, so that's about an average difficulty, this question on here. Okay, so the last problem that we're going to go over is from 2017, so it's a very recent problem. And again, it's a problem number 1. Okay, it introduces a class called digits, right? And what digits does is it actually takes an integer and it stores those integers' digits inside of an array list, one digit at a time. So if I have the number 15,704, it stores the digits one element at a time, so 15704. So it breaks down the integer into a bunch of digits that are stored inside of an array list, right? And it works for any positive integer greater than or equal to 0, right? It's that or equal to 0 is the important part here. Okay, so in part A, what I need to do is I need to implement the constructor. So what the constructor does, if you remember, it initializes the instance variable. So in this case, the instance variable is an array list of integer objects called digit list. So I need to construct this digit list. So you remember, for the instance variable, it declares the variable, but the digit list doesn't exist yet. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to construct the digit list, and then I have to add the integers in, 15704, like in this example. Okay, and it should work for any positive number greater than or equal to 0. So let me copy the declaration from my problem, public digits int num. And like I said, the first thing I have to do is I have to construct my digit list. So I'm going to say digit list equals new array list of integer objects. And that'll make it so that I have an empty list now. So now I can add them, right? Add each digit one at a time. So if we think about, if I want to break down the integer here into digits, right? The integer is called num. If I want to break it down into digits, we've done these algorithms before where we use the modulus and we do mod 10. So mod 10 is going to isolate the last digit, right? So it'll isolate 4. So I can add 4 to my list. Now the next number that I want to isolate, or that I'm going to isolate, is the 0, right? So then I want to add it, but I don't want it to add it to the end of my list, because then it would go 4, then 0 after it. I want it to add it before it. So what we're noticing is when we isolate these digits, we're going to add them to the beginning of the array list, right? So that's important for our loop. So I'm going to use while, and I'm going to say while num is greater than 0. We're going to come back and modify this for a specific case, but for now we're going to say while num is greater than 0, I'm going to add num mod 10. So I'm going to say digit list dot add num mod 10. Right? So I'm adding whatever's in the ones place. And then I'm going to update num by dividing it by 10. And we've done this before. So now it's going to divide num by 10, so the next time through, so the first time through, let's say, it's going to add 4 to my digit list, okay, and then it's going to divide it by 10, so now I have 1570. So now I want to add 0. Now remember, we said we want to add it to the beginning of my array list. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say at index 0, add num mod 10, so it adds it to the beginning. Okay, so that adds it to the beginning, and that updates num by dividing by 10, so the next time through it's 157, and it'll add 7 to the beginning. Then 15, so it'll add 5 to the beginning, and then 1, so it'll add 1 to the beginning. Then the last time through, 1 divided by 10 is 0, so then it breaks my loop because the condition is false. Now there's one additional thing that I need to do in this constructor, and that is, what about the case when the digit is already 0? Well, if the digit's already 0, my while loop is not, the condition's false, so it won't add any digits. So what I need to do here is, at the beginning, I'm going to say if num is equal to 0, then I'm going to do digit list dot add 0, and then that's the end of it, right? So now that's the end of my constructor. That will initialize the digit list with all the correct values. So that's part A. For part B, what it wants us to do is it wants to implement a method called isStrictlyIncreasing. Right? And what isStrictlyIncreasing does is it returns true if the elements of digit lists appear in strictly increasing order, otherwise it returns false. So for the examples here, here's our 7. 7 is strictly increasing. By default, if it's just one integer, it has to be strictly increasing. Right? 1, 3, 5, 6, those numbers are increasing. 1, 3, 5, 6 are getting bigger, so that's true. 1, 3, 3, 6, that's false, because strictly increasing means that the numbers cannot be equal to each other. So the 3 and the 3 are not strictly increasing. 1, 5, 3, 6, well, it decreases from 5 to 3. And then 6, 5, 3, 1, 0, that's false because it decreases the entire way. Right? So for is strictly increasing, I need to look at the values one at a time in the array list and determine if they are greater than the one before it. Right? As long as they're greater than the one before it, it's true. So let me copy the declaration. Public Boolean is strictly increasing. And for this one, I'm going to access the array list one at a time, and I'm not modifying it anyway. Right? I'm not trying to change the array list, so I can use a for each loop. But before I do that, I'm going to create a Boolean, and I'll call it inc for increasing. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to assume that it's true, and then try to prove that it's false. So I'm going to say for each integer num in, so if you remember the name of my array list is digit list. Oh, so here's a problem. With my for each loop, I can't compare adjacent values. I can't compare one value to the one before it. So I'm actually going to have to use a regular for loop here. So I'm going to say for int I equal to, and the key thing here is I'm comparing it to the one before it, but if we think about anything that's index 0, right, there is no element before it, so I have to start at index 1. And I'm going to do I less than digit list dot size I plus plus. So now this is going to go through the entire thing. Digit list is a lowercase d. Okay, I'm going to go through the entire array list, and I'm going to compare it to the element before it. Now there is one issue with this, again, and that is this example. What happens when there is only one element in digit list? Well, it's not going to go through this for loop. So I'm going to say in the beginning, if digit list dot size is less than or equal to, I don't know if they give us a, let's look at the precondition really quick. Num is greater than or equal to 0. So okay. So we know that, let's just say if the size is equal to 1. So if it's a one-digit number, then by default it's strictly increasing, so I'm going to return true. Okay, remember return means it stops right there. So if the size is equal to 1, which means it's a one-digit number, it is strictly increasing, so I return true. For all other cases, which means it's at least a two-digit number, I'm going to compare the element to the one before it. So I'm going to say if digit list dot get I is less than or equal to digit list dot get I minus 1. So if it's less than or equal to the one before it, then I'm going to set increasing to be false. And that goes through the entire array list. So if it's less than or equal to the one before it, then increasing is false. Right? And then at the end, I just return that Boolean variable. So if it goes through the entire array list and every element is greater than the one before it, then increasing will remain true for the entire thing, and then it'll return true. If any one element is less than or equal to the one before it, then it'll set increasing to false. There's no way of turning it back to being true, so it's going to return false. Okay, so that's the last one. All right, guys. If you have questions about any of these problems, please show up to office hours. Our next office hours are Thursday, April 2nd at 9:30 a.m., and I'll see you guys there. Have a good day.